welcome back. This week I am getting started on a fairly grand project. I have a original bodice in my collection from around 1899 that I am absolutely in love with, and this evening bodice just begs to be recreated. It has all sorts of interesting secrets and strange things that I have found in exploring it. I'm going to not only reproduce that, but figure out what sort of skirt would have gone with it, make the petticoats and all the other parts that I need, and this week I'm getting started with making the shoes that should go with it, which does require a fair bit of research. Unlike some of the later years, once we get to the 19-teens, where there are so many images of visible shoes on women from very precise years, in 1899, they're still wearing very long skirts to the ground. You can't physically see their shoes most of the time in images. Advertisements that show the shoes rather than just mentioning them are only just becoming more and more prominent. More fashion magazines are coming out, but there's still a lot of limited resources to find out precisely what was worn for evening shoes in 1899. So the research path that I took for this, similar to I do for many other years, is to start off trying to find any picture-based or heavy description-based resources for around that year. So I started at 1897 and went up to 1906. Now I know 1906 is obviously far too late for what I am doing. Styles may have changed dramatically by that point, but it helps me to anchor the shoes that I see in museums, to understand that that style came in 1904 or in 1906. Therefore, I know that that is too late. Otherwise, a lot of the things that you see in museums, the beautiful examples, have a very vague date range to them, and it's sometimes very hard to actually pinpoint what year they're from until you start doing that research of when did that style appear. So I'm giving myself a little bit of a wide range of research, and I'm looking at magazines and advertisements, articles, shoe manufacturing books, any place that I can find images of shoes that will hopefully define evening shoes. The first step was figuring out what they called them. Evening shoes is a fairly broad term, and they might have had other terminology at the time. Just typing in evening shoes will probably bring up vaguely what I'm looking for, but hopefully I can find the exact phrase that they use, so I can put it in quotations when I'm searching and find just that, which seemed to be, in 1899, evening slippers. Occasionally evening shoes was used, occasionally evening pumps, but usually evening slippers. So I started with that phrase that I found and looked for any images that I could find. And there were a fair number, which actually surprised me in terms of their styling. I expected these shoes to look akin to what I thought of as the 1890s shoe, a very low heel with a very long pointed toe. It's a really iconic style of the 1890s. It doesn't really exist in other eras, and I figured it would still be popular 1898, 1899, but it turns out for evening shoes, it wasn't. It was still around in some other styles. It was starting to transition, but for evening shoes, the style of heel, the height of the heel, the type of toe shape was honestly pretty much exactly the same as the 19-teen shoes that I had previously made, which thankfully for me meant that I didn't have to make a whole new last for this particular pair, go with a completely different style of heel that I wasn't as familiar with. That I can save for future pairs of 1890 shoes that I definitely still want to make, but don't have to do this time. Once I had an idea of the general shape, I started looking at what the uppers could look like. Most commonly, what I found over and over again was either a very plain pump or perhaps a few simple straps that went straight across the foot. The more elaborate cutout lattice work styles seemed to really come in starting around 1903 and were very established by 1906. There were a few styles that have a very large tongue on them that were much more reminiscent of the colonial era general shoe that they were sort of cosplaying in a way. And while I really liked the straps, I liked the large tongue, I just kept trying to come up with designs with that style, and I just wasn't happy with them. And I kept coming back to the basic, simple pump, which the more I thought about it, the more I realized if I do a basic, simple pump, perhaps this can be used for lots of other years, lots of other outfits. I won't necessarily have to make a brand new pair of evening shoes if I make a 1908 evening gown or even a 1914 evening gown. Perhaps this can be a really practical pair of shoes. The next question then, once I decided on a plain pump, was what sort of leather or fabric should it be made out of? Well, in my case, I really wanted leather so I could walk outside. There were definitely examples that talked about white satin or black satin, or even taking the silk satin from your evening gown and making it into a pair of shoes to match precisely. That all seemed really interesting, but I want to be able to wear these outside. I don't want to change into them when I get indoors just to be safe. So that meant leather, and by far the most common leather that I found mentioned was a black patent leather. I did find some examples of an iridescent purple leather that's sort of a coppery iridescent. However, finding that particular leather still being made today, a little bit more difficult than finding a good black glazed patent style leather. So that was the choice that I went with. That, of course, meant that this was turning out to be a really basic black shoe with not much going on. So I needed something fancier. I needed something interesting. I kept going back to the straps, to the large tongue, just wasn't liking it. And I realized a lot of the examples, a lot of the images, and some of the descriptions talked about having beaded shoes. Having these beautiful, elaborate, encrusted toes on the shoes with cut steel beads. There are lots of different designs, some of which just sit on the toes, some of which carry up and over around straps or around the back of the shoe. There are lots of different options. And so I realized before I got into figuring out exactly what my design needed to be, I needed to source these beads because the size, the color, the type of beads, whether they were the very, very minute micro beads or the slightly larger cut steel styles, or whether I could actually find matching what they call nail head beads as well, meant that I would have to adjust the design to fit what I could source. I spent a lot of hours looking through, trying to find a large quantity of matching beads for sale that were unused, but failed pretty miserably at that. It just wasn't happening. They were generally fairly expensive. There were usually not more than 20 inches available. That's not going to be enough, and I didn't want to have to try and mix and match through lots of different sellers, hoping that I would get enough beads that looked similar enough that I could use them together. It was just very stressful. What I found instead were a number of cut steel bead trims from around the same time, many of which look to be fairly damaged, and if you've ever handled trims from this time, a lot of them are not in a survivable condition, meaning that the thread has started to rot or deteriorate for whatever reason, and the beads are just going to start falling off. A little bit of stress, a little bit of manipulation, and the thread will break. Those trims can't be anything other than a stationary display piece, and I would rather be able to take those, give the beads new life, in my case, learn something about how that trim was actually produced and how it's made, perhaps be able to reproduce it with thread that's in good condition later, but that gave me a large quantity of matching beads. I went ahead and found a silver example as well as an iridescent example, and decided once they came in, I would figure out which one I wanted to go with. Not surprisingly, I fell in love with the iridescent one as soon as it arrived, putting it on top of the black leather. It was just beautiful. It stood out in all the right ways. So I knew that I not only had a sort of mid-sized seed bead to work with, but also had some matching nail heads. So I went looking for a design, looking at original shoes, seeing what perhaps I could take and adjust to fit the size and styles of beads that I had, and eventually, after many, many hours of searching, came across this beautiful pair from the Met that has a sort of spider web look to it, which I really love because I do have a soft spot for all of the spooky things, and I thought that'd be a great design for me to alter slightly, perhaps add in a few other little elements to it, and so I decided to take that design, remake it a little bit, and start in on the process. Now, though I have done lots of beading, lots of embroidery, I have never done that particular sort of beading on leather before. Thankfully for me, I have an example from around the late 1870s, early 1880s, which is much earlier, but the particular process of beading should be fairly similar. And what I learned from that was that they don't individually put on each bead. They actually bead it in strands. So they have a distance of, in my case, I usually was going with around 4 beads at one time. They did a similar number in terms of their distance. They were just much smaller beads. So that way you only have so many perforations rather than the entire leather piece having tons of holes in it that will make it weak and end up causing it to split with time. So they have a whole process for this, thankfully, which made it much faster, much easier, and I got to work on starting this very elaborate and beautiful design, hoping that that would be enough to give the shoes some interest and life beyond just being a basic black pair of pumps. The pattern itself is incredibly simple and almost exactly the same as the base of the previous pair of shoes that I had made off of this last, so it didn't really require me remaking a really complex pattern. It's just a simple pump. I just basically changed the top line to change how high up the open part of the pump went on my foot. From there, I transferred the paper pattern over to cardstock so it can be reused time and time again more efficiently, and I started transferring that pattern over to the leather by way of a watercolor pencil, which is a trick that I learned from the sandal making kit that I used recently. And it was especially useful when it came to the beading pattern because it allowed me to lay out the base design in a barely visible way. I can see it just glinting off of the surface when I'm working, but it won't be obvious once the beading goes into place. The actual process of beading was a little bit slow, not because of the techniques that I was using, but because of the fact that these beads, being antiques, are incredibly inconsistent. And though I have a tiny needle, about a quarter of the beads wouldn't actually fit over it. So I had to make sure to check out every single bead as I was putting on a set of 4 or 5, make sure it fit over the needle and would actually thread down. So the process was a little slow going, but the great thing is the designs are really built to be done in these small chunks. So the long lines might have lots of little branches to fill things out and create decoration, but they seem consistently to occur every 4 or 5 beads. Basically every single time that there is a stitch put through the leather, lots of little beads branch off from that one spot. So you have far fewer perforations that you need to make in the leather than you otherwise would for such a complex design. I chose to bind the edge with a silk grosgrain ribbon. Historically, they apparently were using what's called a binding machine at this point in time, which sort of stitches over the cut edge of the exterior leather. I don't have this machine, I don't really have this option, so folding over the grosgrain ribbon was the closest that I was going to really be able to get to that appearance. For the sole leather, it's fairly lightweight for a number of reasons. First off, this is going to be an evening shoe, a dancing shoe. You don't want a really heavy, thick sole that won't allow your foot to move and flex easily. It's also not something you're going to be walking miles and miles in, so you don't need to worry about that wear and tear being a major issue. And most importantly, as I discovered, the vast majority of evening shoes during this time are done as turn shoes, meaning that they are stitched wrong side out and then turned right side out, so your sole cannot be too heavy for that, otherwise it simply won't turn. This is just one method of assembling shoes for the time, but it does have those requirements. I chose this time around to cut the sole on the last so that way I can get a very precise fit to the shape. It's a little hard to get a pattern directly off of the sole as it is a fairly curvy last along the bottom, and this allows me to get a precise cut up against the last for that sole shape. Since this is a turn shoe, the stitches are essentially done through the middle of this sole, meaning that you won't see any of the stitches on the exterior. In order to properly hide those stitches that are only supposed to go part way through the sole, you have two channels. One is on the interior, and that is just cut in about midway deep through the sole. That's where you start putting in your stitches. And then the other one is on the exterior, and this actually gets cut away either at an angle or by cutting down and over. I have this particular tool which allows me to do it a little bit faster, and this allows you to sort of hide the stitches on the exterior as they come up through the upper. So all of this process is just done in order to accommodate those hidden stitches for turn shoes. The back portion of the shoe is going to actually wrap down around the heel. The heel breast is curved and the sole itself will wrap around that, meaning that I need to pare this down really, really thin at this very end. I actually had to spend a good amount of time looking at my originals, looking at instructions from this era to understand how they managed this back heel section, because though this portion makes perfect sense to me, how they managed to connect the upper to something around the heel, and then the heel itself to all of that, wasn't quite adding up. Historically, in the 18th century, where I'm coming from in terms of shoemaking knowledge, this would be done via the insole, which would also be out of a fairly weighty leather. But from what I can see in the originals I have, and from the descriptions that I have, this should be a really lightweight leather, so there had to be some other option. So I continue to work on my sole, putting in all of the holes with my awl that I needed to for each one of the stitches, going ahead and prepping all of that process because I knew that's how the sole needed to be done. All the while during trying to figure out the best way to deal with the insole, and for that matter, what should be there as a shank in this era, meaning the support that fits underneath the arch of the foot. There were some mentions of shanks, some said they didn't do them for all styles. The versions that I have sometimes have cardboard, but I can't stitch through cardboard in order to anchor the backside of the upper or to anchor the heel. So there had to be something leather back there. And one of my pairs of shoes was just barely pulling away from the edge far enough for me to find that it had an instep leather that also functioned as the place where the backside of the shoe was all attached together. Not unlike the way that I do for 18th century shoes, except that the heel itself will be made up separately, so I don't have to worry about it stitching in the heel cover, which is my least favorite thing to do for 18th century shoes. The only major difference that I will have between this shape that you see here and the insoles that I usually do for 18th century shoes is that this will stop before it gets under the ball of the foot. It doesn't extend all the way into the toe section, so that way that part can stay lightweight and flexible. The heel portion of this shank is then prepped not unlike the sole in front, where there is a channel cut for the beginning of the stitches. I chose to go ahead and do an angle on the outer portion rather than cutting down and over. Honestly, if I went back into this again, I would probably change that in order to hide my stitches better on the upper. They got a little close to the edge of the heel for me, so that's something I would update the next time I do this, but it did still turn out okay for this version. Begin the lasting process. The sole goes on first wrong side out, and then the upper goes on wrong side out as well. In order to protect the beads, I put a thin cotton wadding between the last and the upper. This will bulk it out a little bit, but as I said, in the end I'm going to be flipping this right side out and then I have to relast it. So having a little bit of extra space there is going to make the process of putting the last back in once I flip it far easier. In fact, it does say in a lot of documentation when it comes to turn shoes to not pull tightly when you are lasting the uppers of turn shoes, at least not as tightly as you normally would with other styles. The lasting process, though, is just the same as it is with any technical style of construction. You start by anchoring the back, making sure that it's centered up, move forward to the toe. I tried to make sure that I got the beads as centered up over the toe as I could, but it wasn't exactly perfect on either one of my shoes in the end. It was just really hard to get that precise, And honestly, I think it was more an issue of the beaded design being a little off from where center should be, more so than the lasting process skewing the uppers. The important thing here is that I'm making sure that all of the wrinkles are nice and smooth. We don't have any wrinkles that extend out to the upper portion of the shoe. They should all just sit folded nicely over the sole portion and not be visible on the exterior. I'm doing the leather portion of the upper separately from the lining, because the lining will need to be pulled incredibly tight because we are working inside out, and that ends up needing to be smaller once I flip it around, which I know isn't technically entirely possible, but I'm going to try and get as close as I can so that way the lining doesn't have a lot of wrinkles once I turn the shoe right side out. The stitching is then done the whole way around using a standard shoemaker's stitch. I actually did try the first shoe in this pair with a different stitch, trying to mimic what they called the Mackay stitch, which is essentially a chain stitch. And it was done by the Mackay machine at this time, and it's something you commonly see on welted shoes, but apparently they were also using it for turn shoes. And it is visible on a couple pairs of shoes that I have around this era using not only this method, but other methods like channel stitching, which I will show later in another video. And I really wanted to mimic that if I could, but there's not a good way to do that without the machine. I initially tried to do it with a tambour hook, but my tambour hook was just not big enough, and it caused a lot of issues. Once I had started the process, gotten about 10 stitches in, I realized it was taking far too long, but there wasn't a way for me to switch between the two methods at that point. So that shoe stitching took forever compared to this method, and I am going to try and figure out how to fix that issue before the next shoe that I make, because it's going to have that particular type of stitching in order to replicate an original, but there has to be a better hook, a better option, something out there tool-wise that will make that feasible. So I'm sticking with the shoemaker stitch here, putting in a reinforcement thread around the toe. It's just spiral wrapped around those interior loops and adds a little bit of security around the toe where the stitches are close together and could potentially end up pulling through the leather if there's too much stress there. Once everything is stitched up, then it's time to reduce the bulk. Trim back the seam allowances, put clips where the little folds are, all the same sorts of things you would expect to do when you're sewing clothing. Since I'm working with leather for the upper, there's a fair bit of bulk around that sort of seam allowance. One of the ways to make it feel like the bulk is not there is to add a little sort of cushion in the middle that only goes up to where that seam allowance ends. I am choosing to do this via a piece of wool broadcloth. That's just scrap fabric that I have laying around, and this will add a little bit of cushion and waterproofing under the foot and will fill out that space. This is not something historically that I have seen done in this particular era. I've seen it in the 18th century, and I have seen it mentioned throughout the mid-19th century. I just haven't seen it in examples this late. Cementing that into place allows me to not only anchor down the seam allowance of the leather around the edges so that way it doesn't flip up and get in the way as I relast, but like I said, it allows me to sort of equalize that bulk underneath my foot. The layer of fabric, rather than being glued down, can actually be adhered down by way of beeswax rubbed on. This is something that I found in shoemaking manuals of this era, which I love because it's a technique that I was taught many years ago for 18th century shoes, and it was great to see it still being mentioned. I then need to pull the shoe off the last, starting in the back, and then sort of working the front until the suction gives way and the entire thing pops off, which is fairly easy with this style since it does have that added little cushion in the front that gave me some extra space. The sole then kind of gets crushed and folded in order for me to start shoving the shoe right side out. It's not a pretty process, and it's a little stressful when you're doing it over all of those beads, but everything came out perfectly fine. There was no damage from the turning process, and there was no damage from any of the elasting process either. thanks to that little cushion. When I get down to the toe end, sometimes I need a little assistance. There are such things as turning sticks that are just perfectly sized for that, but I have an old shoemaking hammer which has a handle that is also pretty close in size to what I need, and I've just been using that for years. So once I get almost to the very end of the shoe, I just pull the tip back and everything pops into place. I then will start the process of relasting the right way out. This whole thing's a little weird for me because I'm working on right and left, and this is actually the first time I've ever done a turn shoe right and left, so I had to think about it hard, the fact that I was starting my right shoe on my left last, and vice versa. But once I've gotten the front part relasted, I can then insert that shank piece, making sure it's lined up correctly. I also need to put in a heel reinforcement. This particular era tends to have toe reinforcements and heel reinforcements. Not everything had the toe reinforcement, especially if it's a leather upper, so I chose to forego that this time around. But the heel cup, that heel space, usually is very, very stiff. So I have a white leather that, honestly, I don't know what it is. I've had it for years, it was gifted to me, and it is incredibly stiff and paper-like once it is dry. So I'm just wetting that down, shaping it over the back of one of the lasts, letting it dry into its correct shape. That will be inserted between the exterior layer and the lining before the back is relasted. Again, there's a fancy tool in order to do this properly, but I've developed a pretty good method of managing it from the bottom of the shoe with just my hands. Now that everything is in place and is starting to form and shape to the last the correct way out, I can start to work on that back section of the heel, stitching it into place just like we did with the front section. Unlike 18th century shoes where the heel cover is stitched on and then the heel itself is inserted, this era preferred to do a knock-on style of heel, meaning that the heel itself is fully wrapped in leather or fabric and essentially finished off before it's actually cemented onto the shoe. This is a bit of a complex process to cover the heel either way, especially with the fact that I'm working with a leather that I can't get wet. Because as I discovered the last time around, the shine on this leather is not really waterproof when I go to soak it. It seems to resist a little bit of water pretty well, but not a full soaking, so it's a fairly difficult process in order to get this curve around the heel with a dry leather that doesn't want to stretch nearly as much as I would like it to, just making sure that I'm gradually working around those curves and trying to avoid getting any wrinkles. For the rest of the heel, seam allowances just get trimmed back, snipped open, folded down, and cemented into place because the sole leather and the heel cap will cover up those sections. It is good to go ahead and reduce the bulk of those edges though, so that way it's a nice smooth transition. The heel itself is then just cemented into place around the base of the shoe. There will be nails put in near the end to help make sure that this won't shift or move around, so it will have some extra security, but for right now the cement will hold it into place very well. I just have to make sure that I get everything lined up properly. The sole is then pulled back around that heel breast and trimmed into shape. Also going to make sure that I've pared it down as much as I can around all the edges. It's still a little thick in a few places, so I'll go back and do a few adjustments to clean up the edges, make them as thin as possible around the very edge of the sole. The heel cap is also cemented into place and then nailed for security. The nails hold it into place to make sure that it won't shift and twist as I'm walking, or to begin with, as I am cutting this piece down to fit the shape of the heel exactly. The edges of this heel cap and the edges of the sole will actually then be painted black with a burnishing wax. This is something that will shine up really beautifully with a little bit of abrasion later. Historically, I can find plenty of examples of black leather shoes that have either the edges painted black and the sole left in its natural state, or the entire sole painted black. I wasn't sure which I wanted to do, so I went ahead and just started with the edges being painted black, and then unlasting the entire shoe, which is now pretty close to complete, but all of the last steps are done from the inside. I have to cement down that shank leather so that way it won't shift back and forth. The shape of the shoe has dried enough that I don't need to worry about having the last in the shoe in order to keep the shape. I'm then nailing down into the heel, as I mentioned earlier, so that way it's guaranteed to stay in place. And the really thin leather insole is then cemented in place on top of all of that. So that way the nails are covered up, the wool is covered up, the seam allowances are covered up, everything is nice and clean on the interior. This is not done in every single shoe completely that I have seen historically, but I prefer the look of a very clean interior like this. At that point, I did decide that I wanted to blacken in the entire sole. I was either going to do that or very carefully do a border of black around all of the edges to clean them up, and that just seemed really stressful. So I decided to use burnishing wax for the entire sole, and as you can see, a paper towel or a clean cloth, little bit of abrasion, and that shines up beautifully.